Lecture 6, the 30th of May, 1963. Ladies and gentlemen, I must start with an announcement. I shall have to cancel the lecture in 2 weeks' time because I am taking part in the Europa Symposium in Vienna. There will be no lecture the following Thursday anyway because of the holiday on Corpus Christi, so we shall next meet in 3 weeks' time. I should like to begin by summarizing some of the things I may have said a little too hurriedly at the end of the last lecture, and shall then use the rest of the lecture to take a relatively close look at Kant's text, in order to say a few things about the relation between theoretical and practical philosophy in Kant. The first point, then, is that I should remind you that the difficulties we have been experiencing with Kant's doctrine of the antinomies can be traced back to the fact that Kant's philosophy has a dual character. On the one hand, there is a critical strand of thought, that is, the dissolution of dogmatic ideas that had simply been handed down, and that he overcomes by recourse to a constitutive subjectivity. At the same time he sets limits by establishing that the knowledge the naive consciousness tends to think of as the knowledge of things is in reality knowledge that arises merely in the subjective mind and cannot therefore be said to be the direct knowledge of existence. On the other hand, opposed to this and at least as powerful, there is the other strand of thought according to which he would like to try to salvage the objective character of thought through this subjective analysis. Moreover, he aims to go even further than this since he strives to rescue what before him was known as ontology, and what we are again inclined to call ontology today, and he hopes to rescue it in a particular sphere, namely the sphere of the intelligible, and this means for him the sphere of morality or freedom. This dual character is what actually motivates the strange attitude that Kant adopts towards the problem of freedom. If we assert that the doctrine of causality and freedom in the Critique of Pure Reason has been presented in an antinomic manner, we do not entirely do justice to the situation, since the final result of the analysis of the third antinomy does not take the form, it can be like this or it can be like that. Instead, given the general thrust of the analysis in the Critique of Pure Reason, the situation is rather that the discussion of freedom and conditioning is broken off. It is as if Kant were asserting that for me to put the question in those terms is itself to make an error that prevents further progress. The implication is that if I am debarred from putting the question, I shall remain trapped in the empirical realm in which causality rules, and that the only claim I may not make on behalf of this causality is that it is absolutely valid in the realm of empirical objects. Notwithstanding this, in the Critique of Pure Reason, at least in the doctrine of the antinomies, the crucial decision was really made in favor of causality, in the spirit of the theoretical use of reason only with the caveats we have already discussed. 2. In contrast to that, the other side, what we can call the ontological side, or perhaps the preserving, salvaging side of Kant, or indeed the side that opposes the universal skepticism of a consistent nominalism, is expressed in a teaching that does not actually occur in the doctrine of the antinomies in this form. This is the doctrine that the moral sphere is in principle separate from that of knowledge and, positively, that it is the sphere of freedom, or as Kant himself phrases it in a very prominent passage, in the realm of morality freedom is a fact of experience. Point 3. I tried to show you last time what meaning can be given to this strange thesis about the experience of freedom, when we set out to examine aspects of the concept of motivation and the dual character of law. But at any rate, we can summarize once more the meaning of the doctrine of the third antinomy, the antinomy of causality and freedom. If causality rules absolutely, if, in other words, there is nothing but the law of cause and effect, this would make an absolute of the laws imposed by human beings on the things in themselves of which they actually know nothing, that is, of everything that is needed to control nature, both human and extra-human. This would confer on that absolute the same quality of blindness and externality which, as I explained to you last time, is characteristic of causality in nature and knowledge in terms of the categories as developed in the spirit of Kant. The domination of nature, and we might well say, as blind domination it means mere nature, would itself become an absolute, for if, on the other hand, there were nothing but freedom, or as Kant puts it, freedom without guidance, Without a law that could organize the phenomenal world, it would be a form of freedom that is quite devoid of any element of law, and hence it too would signify a relapse into a mere state of nature, namely into the natural chaos of a purely arbitrary state of affairs. It is interesting to note that on the one hand, in his critique of the consequences that the doctrine of absolute freedom would have, Kant uses the same expression blind that he also used when he was speaking of the exclusive dominance of causality. 5. His philosophy as a whole is opposed to both. It is opposed to the making absolute of the mechanical principle, and the critique of this making absolute of the mechanical principle forms the essential content of the critique of judgment, and it is no less opposed, on the other hand, to the amorphous, accidental and arbitrary. For his part, Kant never deviates for a single second from his conviction that the unity to be discovered in our reason must also be ascribed to things in themselves. If those things are to be otherwise than truly chaotic, a relapse into utter blindness and disorder. I do not wish to discuss here the idea that the unity imposed on the world by the organization of the rational logos must necessarily also constitute a determination of the world itself, but it does appear to me that at this point, there is a crucial fallacy in the Kantian philosophy itself, one which had a calamitous influence throughout the whole of post-Kantian philosophy. It arises because the category of absolute unity was hypostatized and conflated with the absolute, and this was something against which the most significant and the most free-spirited of the German idealists made the most energetic protests. What I have in mind here above all is what might be called the philosophical substance of Hölderlin's thinking. He, foremost among others, interpreted this idea of the absolute nature of the one and of unity in such a way as to insist that the true unity was the reconciliation of the many, and not a mere identity which came into existence by riding roughshod over the many of which it is composed. 6. This inflection of thought is self-evidently of the very greatest significance for immoral philosophy, because it leads beyond the pervasive theme in Kant and Fichte, that reality is nothing but the raw material for realizing the unity of a merely human reason. But for the moment, I do not wish to pursue the very far-reaching implications of this idea, for immoral philosophy, any further. The Kantian construct at any rate is, as you can perhaps recognize, a construct created from its terminus ad quem, that is to say, the entire doctrine of the antinomies is designed to bring together the idea of conformity to laws and unity on the one hand, and freedom on the other. Moving on from the attempt to prove this basically self-contradictory thesis, we can explain the signs of the further contradictions to which the doctrine of causality and freedom led, although at the same time we cannot but acknowledge the fact that Kant's greatness manifests itself, in the completely frank and open way in which he makes these contradictions explicit. I have said that this dialectic is not just a dialectic which exposes our false use of reason, but a dialectic inherent in the situation itself. We can see this plainly in one of the later chapters of the Critique of Pure Reason, that I would like to discuss in some detail, partly because its fundamental significance for Kant's grounding of his moral philosophy has been extraordinarily underestimated. It is to be found in the Transcendental Doctrine of Method, and the chapter bears the title The Canon of Pure Reason. This entire second part of the Critique of Pure Reason is in general far too little studied. The relevant section here is entitled The Ultimate End of the Pure Employment of Our Reason. This doctrine of the ultimate end of pure reason makes a major contribution to the doctrine of contradiction, and our understanding of the contradiction with which we were concerned in the previous lectures, because the ultimate end of the pure employment of our reason turns out to be practice, action, and not theoretical knowledge, or what Kant consistently refers to in this section as speculation. 7. This is how the strange and genuinely contradictory element arises, even more contradictory than the contradictions of the doctrine of the antinomies. In the spirit of the doctrine of the antinomies we can say that causality triumphs, because in the realm of experience we can only think causally, because once we go beyond the realm of experience we end up in insoluble contradictions, regardless of whether we affirm causality or deny it. Whereas here, from the standpoint of the primacy of practice, the triumph of freedom, if you will allow me this strategic trope of speech, gazes out at us in an equally unambiguous way. We can say, therefore, that while Kant criticizes the antinomies of pure reason, the necessity of these antinomies becomes manifest in the Kantian theory itself. It does this because his own philosophy amounts to the statement that in the realm of theory causality is dominant, while in the practical realm only freedom counts. The contradiction this implies is never resolved other than in a remote and vague hypothesis. So we have the situation that the antinomies that result merely from the false use of our reason have seemingly been resolved to everyone's satisfaction, but they then turn out to have the last word, since each side of the antinomy reappears in the very constitution of the two principal spheres of philosophy, namely in theoretical and practical philosophy. So much by way of introduction. I would like to pass on now to this chapter in the doctrine of method. Kant speaks here of the ultimate end of the employment of our reason. He says, reason is impelled by a tendency of its nature to go out beyond the field of its empirical employment, and to venture in a pure employment, by means of ideas alone, to the utmost limits of all knowledge, and not to be satisfied save through the completion of its course in the apprehension of a self-subsistent systematic whole. 8. When we read here in Kant of the tendency of its nature, if we understand correctly the concept of nature as Kant borrowed it from the 18th century as a whole, and especially from Rousseau, we realize that it means more than something psychological, more than the idea that our nature is such that we ourselves impel our reason to the point of the absolute. Instead, nature here has to be taken in its strict sense to mean that reason is impelled by its own essence to go beyond the possible limits of experience. This thought, ladies and gentlemen, is in fact extraordinarily plausible and extraordinarily illuminating. If you cast your minds back to Kant's treatment of the third antinomy, you will recollect that it amounts to breaking off the argument that would run on into infinity. It is, if we can put it idiomatically, in a way Kant himself did not scorn to express himself on such occasions, it is a little as if he were to say to reason in a laconic way, this is an aspect of bourgeois thrift, dwell in the land and lead an upright life and don't incur any excessive expense, otherwise you will run up debts that you are unable to pay off, and you will end up in bankruptcy. However, there is something unsatisfactory about restricting the argument in this way, because there is a sense in which it runs counter to reason. Breaking off the rational line of argument is incompatible with the requirement of reason, that it should be allowed to run its course, that it should not be suspended by any external factor. This is the case because the corollary of reason is the idea of truth. Reason is essentially the embodiment of consciousness which has truth as its goal, or so we might define it. If it is interrupted, broken off, suspended, and if it is told that it has to surrender its own true purpose, the search for truth, then reason is prevented by pure rationality, in order to make it see reason, from satisfying the requirements of its own nature. In fact, that is precisely what happens in the doctrine of the antinomies, and if that doctrine is not entirely satisfactory, and if Kant goes on to consider the sort of arguments we have been examining, then underlying this is the recollection that any such arbitrary interruption, any obstacle blocking the path of the search for truth, really is incompatible with the concept of reason for which the idea of truth is an absolute. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that Kant's frequent repetition of such phrases as the tendency of nature, or the contradictions in which reason is caught up, have to be taken extremely seriously. That is to say, this interruption of the progress of reason that Kant is calling for is just as hard to reconcile with reason as its unrestricted progress, and leads just as certainly to contradictions, as he has so plausibly argued. I believe that it is only when we examine this other side of the entire problem of the antinomies, that we properly understand what is actually at stake here. He speaks here, without comment, of the speculative interest of reason, when it is really a matter of a theoretical interest, although we may say of his terminology that he always calls theoretical reason speculative when it goes beyond the realms of possibility, when it is used transcendentally. This means that the concept of the speculative has for him pejorative, contemptuous overtones, whereas his successors reinstate it, and perhaps you will be able to understand why. It is because they realized, Fichte and Hegel, that the self-limitation that Kant here expects from reason is actually incompatible with its own concept. He goes on to say that he wishes to leave aside the success which attends pure reason in its speculative exercise, that is, in its reference to transcendental ideas, and sets out instead to inquire whether or not these ultimate concepts, God, the freedom of the will and the immortality of the soul, have any theoretical interest at all. He formulates the issue as follows, and this may perhaps give you some idea of what I meant earlier on by the hypostatization of unity in Kant. I shall, for the moment, leave aside all question as to the success which attends pure reason in its speculative exercise, and inquire only as to the problems the solution of which constitutes its ultimate aim, whether reached or not, and in respect of which all other aims are to be regarded only as means. 10. He goes on to make an astonishing statement that he completely fails to follow up. These highest aims must, from the nature of reason, have a certain unity, in order that they may, as thus unified, further that interest of humanity which is subordinate to no higher interest. 11. You can see that here he takes the principle of unity that is inherent in reason, and hence lies on the subjective side of things, and transfers it to the outside world in the form of a postulate about the absolute. In other words, we are looking here at something like a unified world order, based on the unified will of a creator. In a sense this is the suture joining Kantian philosophy and the Christian theology which in fact comes to permeate the closing sections of the Critique of Practical Reason. He says then that the final result of speculation concerns three objects: freedom of the will, the immortality of the soul and the existence of God, and he adds the very remarkable consequence of this that I should like to read you now. In respect of all three the merely speculative interest of reason is very small, and for its sake alone we should hardly have undertaken a labor of transcendental investigation, a labor so fatiguing in its endless wrestling with insuperable difficulties, since whatever discoveries might be made in regard to these matters, we should not be able to make use of them in any helpful manner in concreto, that is, in the study of nature. 12. This passage is so very remarkable because it introduces into Kantian philosophy, at least into his theoretical philosophy, a highly unusual pragmatic tone, that is perhaps the last thing we might expect to encounter in Kant, although it may be more explicable when we recollect that the Critique of Pure Reason is preceded by a motto from Bacon, from whom we would sooner expect to hear sentiments of the kind I have just read out to you. Nevertheless, this is the situation. Kant defines the realm of theory in the Critique of Pure Reason as that of theoretical physics and mathematics. In other words, the mathematical sciences as a whole. It is a little paradoxical that this sphere should turn out to be synonymous with practice in the somewhat narrower and more restricted sense, we might almost say the more Philistine sense that prompts such questions as what's the use of that? What can I do with that? Or how can this take me any further in the technique of mastering nature? For this is very much in the spirit of the empirical sciences, and the ways in which the possibilities of controlling nature are defined in Bacon's Novum Organum, a work which I recommend that you should inform yourselves about. These two concepts of practicism and the domination of nature converge here to the point where, and here we see the paradox emerging clearly, it is theoretical reason in its preoccupation with the knowledge of nature that is linked in a particular sense in Kant's philosophy to the measuring rod of practice. The sense in which this is true is indicated by such questions as what's the use of that? How does this take me any further? What do I get out of the whole thing? In my opinion, it is very beneficial for us to distance ourselves from Kant sufficiently to obtain a clear view of such consequences, and to see that they led him to make an extremely remarkable statement, one that is really quite astounding. He says in effect, very well, then, the existence of God, the possibility of immortality and the freedom of the will, since I can do nothing with these things in the world of experience, they can be a matter of perfect indifference to me. This view of things completely ignores the fact that if death is the ultimate reality, if there is nothing but the brief life that we have, and if we surrender entirely to a blind principle, or rather a non-principle, a dead end, then our lives are exposed to a degree of meaninglessness of which modern philosophy, even in its less rigorous variants, has made an all too liberal and all too popular use. What I mean to say is that my inability to make any sense of God, freedom and immortality, cannot blind us to the fact Ladies and gentlemen, that our entire life, every moment we are alive, assumes a very different complexion depending on whether or not this is all there is. It is barely comprehensible that a thinker of Kant's insight into metaphysics should have simply ignored this basic reality, while the wicked, anti-moral and anti-Christian Nietzsche should have drawn attention to it with his assertion, "But all joy wants eternity." 13. In other words, Nietzsche was aware of the crucial insight that what happens in the world is dependent on immortality, if I may express it like this, and conversely, we might add, the theory of such ideas is bound up with what we experience here. But this is really the heart of this Kantian line of argument, namely the belief that these ideas are a matter of indifference to us, because we cannot do anything with them in terms of our knowledge of nature, or the domination of nature. Hence we find in Kant only the sphere of the knowledge of nature, in the sense of an unrestrained pragmatism which asks what can I do with this, on the one hand, while, on the other, there is the sphere of morality, which is a sphere in which the laws of reason hold absolute sway. But these two spheres are so far apart from each other that, thanks to this split, even genuinely simple and urgent questions like the ones I have just told you about sink without trace as if into a pit, and are lost to view. Ladies and gentlemen, many of you may have already come to philosophy with the expectation and hope that you would discover answers to such questions as is that everything, then, or what will come next, questions which Kant has dismissed as irrelevant for theory. These hopes have now been dashed. I shall not be so bold as to offer you anything better, but I can at least show you at this point the mechanism that has led to this disappointment. It is that even in Kant, who is one of the thinkers from whom you can rightly expect the very greatest things, this strange division into pure practice and pure natural science, which is conceived as the pure domination of nature, spirits away these matters of essential interest. He simply does not perceive them and even says explicitly, God, in so far as we are thinking about theory, is of no concern to us, but as far as our practical behavior goes, well, we do need him there as a working hypothesis. However, on the question of our practical behavior we are no longer concerned with knowledge, but only, as he remarks later on, with the question what shall we do. This has the consequence that at the very point where we are faced with the most crucial interest of reason conceivable, the system of philosophy he has constructed leaves us high and dry. If you wish to complain about philosophy, and you may be justified in so doing, you can at least perhaps see what motives and mechanisms within philosophy itself and after all, Kant and Hegel are philosophy, have led to this disappointing outcome. This is why I have dwelt on this point at such length, for it is one thing to be naively disappointed, and quite another to reflect on the reasons for this disappointment, and to achieve a critical understanding of why philosophy should, to remain within the figure of speech, give us stones rather than bread. Kant speaks wholly in the spirit of scientific determinism, when he says the will may well be free, which means if the will be free, this can have a bearing only on the intelligible cause of our volition. 14. And here, as we have argued at length, the intelligible cause of our volition is incompatible with the concept of freedom, for as regards the phenomena of its outward expressions, that is, of our actions, we must account for them, in accordance with a maxim which is inviolable, and which is so fundamental that without it we should not be able to employ reason in any empirical manner, whatsoever in the same manner as all other appearances of nature, namely, in conformity with unchangeable laws. 15. I should like to add to this, ladies and gentlemen, the structure of the argument that Kant produces at this point, seems to me to contain a mechanistic element. It is as if he were saying all right, then, let us suppose that I introduce the element of freedom somewhere or other, whether in an original free action on the part of the intelligible character, or in the original free postulating of God. But even if I do this, the principle of causality remains utterly intact for the entire realm of experience. Now, if it is really true that the principle of causality can lay claim to the universality Kant ascribes to it, we might well inquire at this point, whether the whole system must not come crashing down if we are forced to concede the existence of the minutest gap, the smallest exception, because if there is just the tiniest amount of freedom, just a little corner, then this must mean that the entire business of a chain of cause and effect has a hole in it, and in that case I can no longer ascribe universality to it, for in that event, it is quite unclear why there should not be an element of freedom in countless other places. But this question, that certainly seems on the face of it to be a question of knowledge, or, as Kant calls it, of speculation, is simply swept under the table when he remarks causality remains in force in the realm of experience, even if somewhere, in far-off Turkey, where nations come to blows, in the realm of the absolute there is an element of freedom. 16 Well, modern science appears at this point to have paid Kant back in full for his strange procedure, by proving to him that in the realm of our progressive understanding of nature, in other words, precisely at the point where he supposed the laws of cause and effect to be absolutely inviolable, this concept of universal causality no longer holds good in the traditional manner. I have now told you a certain amount about the attitude of indifference that characterizes the speculative interest according to Kant, and I have also said that no matter how we act, nothing is more important for us than those ideas which Kant claims are only of significance for our actions. In certain circumstances, for example, they may prevent us from taking any action at all, and the concept of action may fall by the wayside, as is the case with monks of various kinds, with quietist movements, or else with Schopenhauer's philosophy. So these are ideas that can no longer be sustained. Kant then goes on to say, if, again, we should be able to obtain insight into the spiritual nature of the soul, while in the chapter on paralogisms in the Critique of Pure Reason, this was the very thing he had doubted, we could make no use of such insight in explaining the appearances of this present life. 17 So no particular inference could be drawn from this because, in so far as the soul is the object of our knowledge, and therefore a part of the world in space and time, and bound up with the world in space and time, it cannot be thought of as an absolute. Now, we might well say that there is a vast difference, even for theoretical propositions about the possibility of immortality, between saying, on the one hand, that the very idea of the soul is a mere idea, a hypostasis, that we merely assign an absolute status to the synthesizing of phenomena in conceptual form, and, on the other hand, asserting that such a synthesis is the necessary precondition of the plurality of souls. In other words, these so-called metaphysical questions are crucially dependent on the theoretical definition of the term soul, and the attitude of indifference that Kant supposes to exist between these ideas and theory, an indifference felt on both sides of the equation, is anything but dominant. Finally, he says in connection with God that we can indeed take the idea of a supreme intelligence, as he somewhat coyly terms it, from which we would be able to render what is purposive in the constitution and ordering of the world comprehensible in a general sort of way, but we should not be in the least warranted in deriving from it any particular arrangement or disposition, or in boldly inferring any such, where it is not perceived. 18 Now this third assumption makes a legitimate critical point, but it is one we can set aside here, since it is really aimed at a very limited form of rationalism of the kind that was formulated in the so-called Wolffian philosophy, that is, in the systematic adaptation of Leibnizian rationalism for pedagogic purposes. In Wolff the premise of a central monad and a supreme intelligence was used in a direct, naive and narrow-minded way to show how all sorts of natural phenomena were purposively arranged for the convenience of human beings. Thus Wolff actually states that the moon shines at night in order that men should not find everything so dark. 19 So it is obviously illuminating and plausible to find such ideas repudiated here, but it has no bearing on the question of whether the existence of God has any relevance for theoretical reason. Once again, it is necessary for you to think of what has happened here from its own terminus ad quem, for this entire, really rather strange line of argument with its dallying over genuine abysses can really only be explained by pointing out that what he wants to say, come hell or high water, is that these three cardinal terms, the existence of God, freedom and immortality, are not necessary for our knowledge, that is, in theory. In other words, he wishes to assert that they do not need to interest us in theory, but at the same time they are strongly recommended by our reason, and therefore he states that their importance, properly regarded, must concern only the practical point 20, and with that we have reached one of the pivotal points of Kantian philosophy. In general, this concerns the so-called metaphysical ideas, which he cannot salvage for theory, nor can he accept that they have a constitutive importance for theory. Instead he introduces them simply and solely because they are postulates of practical reason. This means that according to the Kantian doctrine the moral law is given to me. It is a fact. Experience teaches me that I should act morally, but lest this experience lead me into inconsistencies. It also contains the implication that I should reckon with the existence of these metaphysical entities so that, and this is one of the great paradoxes of Kantian philosophy, I cannot act freely for the sake of the existence of God, but that God exists only in order that I should act freely. 21. This relationship has been completely inverted, and in consequence practice has gained the absolute priority. That is the actual justification for the thesis that I have developed here, namely the idea that in the philosophy of Kant practice has priority over theory. But we can continue this discussion in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention and I hope you have an enjoyable holiday. Lecture 7, the 18th of June, 1963. Dear colleagues, I hope that we shall now be able to reach the end of this semester in a very concentrated way without further interruptions. I shall certainly do my utmost in this respect, now that the Whitsun holidays are behind us, and even though I was forced by a prior commitment of long standing to cancel 1 hour, to my very great regret. 1. I think the best way to pick up the threads of our previous argument without regurgitating the whole thing once again, would be for me to use this hour to explain again, or rather not again, but in principle, the structure of Kant's moral philosophy in the sense that I wish to give it here, and to do so in conjunction with the text from the doctrine of method that we have begun to interpret, but without making much progress up to now. So I want to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and both reiterate what we have said from the point of view we have been unfolding, and at the same time take the argument a few steps further. I should like to remind you, then, that the 3 cardinal propositions that Kant regards as the cardinal propositions of ethics, are those that maintain the existence of freedom of the will, the immortality of the soul and the existence of God. According to Kant, these 3 propositions have their decisive meaning not in theoretical philosophy, in other words, not in our knowledge of what is the case, but in practical philosophy. This means that, following the Kantian theory, they are strictly, necessarily bound up with the question what shall we do, and can really only be understood and explained in connection with what we should do. Last time I explained in some detail, that the separation of this question from the realm of theory seemed to me to do violence to the problem, that is to say, Kant's disclaimer that theory has no interest in these propositions does not seem to be entirely convincing, for if anything matters to a man in his own life, aside from his actions, then it must be the question whether or not everything comes to an end with his death. I do not wish to repeat this entire complex of arguments here, but would just like to remind you that I criticized this distinction in the last lecture, or one of the earlier lectures. Kant says, as you will recollect, that the theoretical interest in these propositions is very slight. I should like now to attempt to interpret Kant's argument in a perhaps more faithful sense than I did in the last lecture. His claim that the theoretical or speculative interest in these cardinal propositions is slight may possibly be interpreted to mean that there is no real connection between these propositions and our scientific experience together with the foundations of our scientific experience. The question of interest relates simply to the idea that these propositions fall outside the framework of theoretical knowledge, and that it is in fact a matter of indifference to us what their status is. What Kant's way of formulating the matter leads to can indeed be linked to the general tenor of Kantian philosophy, and specifically, with the priority he gives to practice. In such a context knowledge that has no consequences may well appear nugatory, but it is probable that Kant would not have spoken quite so insistently on this point as I did last time, and that all he meant was that theoretical reason, that is, our knowledge of nature, has no great interest in those propositions, because it could not hope to provide a proper explanation of them. There is something in Kant's philosophy that intimates to us that the ideas that we have been discussing are matters that we should not concern ourselves about, that it cannot be in our interest to pursue questions that appear insoluble from the outset in the sphere to which we have assigned them. I regard this line of thought as highly problematic. In the course of the development of modern philosophy, it is this line of thought that has increasingly led to the elimination of those questions worthy of human beings, the questions that have led people to philosophy in the first place. And while in this way, what we might call the process of converting philosophy into a science has advanced inexorably, philosophy itself has increasingly declined in interest, to use Kant's term, that is, it refuses increasingly to make any statement or judgment on those matters about which we expect philosophy to have something to say. Now this rejection of the three crucial propositions, the three cardinal propositions, relates both to experience itself and to the constitutive forms that organize it. In other words, according to Kant, we can neither obtain any answer to these questions from our experience, nor do they really enter effectively into the apparatus of our categories, that is, the preconditions in whose absence it would not be possible for us to experience anything at all. This in its turn brings a particular difficulty in its wake. This is the difficulty that our practical philosophy cannot really be separated from experience in any absolute way, because it is related to our actual actions, which are inevitably concerned with the material of experience. You will all of you have the obvious riposte on your lips. Of course, if anything at all is connected with experience, it must surely be whatever has to do with my own actions, and you are all aware that in the realm of ordinary behavior, we are accustomed to talk about our experience. For example, when we make distinctions between good and evil, that is to say, if you are inexperienced, as it is called, you may do all sorts of things that turn out to be highly dubious, whereas convention would have it that if you are experienced, and able to grasp a situation as a whole, you ought to be in a better position to act rightly, including in a higher sense. I need not enter into a discussion about whether or not there is any truth in this piece of popular wisdom. I would only point out to you that here as elsewhere the rationale of moral philosophy in Kant does make formidable demands upon us. Kant, however, would be opposed to this entire line of argument. Nevertheless, we could well imagine that just as there is such a thing as the form and content of knowledge, a distinction Kant makes, so too there could well be form and content in the realm of practice. That is to say, I cannot imagine any action that does not, by the very fact of becoming an action, relate in some way or other to empirically existing beings, be they things or people. I mean to say that even the noblest, most sublime action is only possible because, in becoming the sacrifice of the man who carries it out, it presupposes his sacrifice as an actual empirical person, and the very worst action involves empirical realities in the same way. Thus if someone wishes to commit a murder he needs firstly a person he can kill, and secondly some such implement as a hammer with which to carry out the deed. So the separation of form and content, this absolute separation, seems to be just as problematic in the realm of practice as it is in that of theory, where, according to Kant, the forms of knowledge only retain their validity to the extent that they relate to the material of experience, to living sensation. To put it rather less loosely and irresponsibly than I have just done, action has both a form and a content. We can speak of the form and content of moral action in the much weightier sense that here too there is a distinction between universal rules, the universal norms in accordance with which we act, however problematic they may be, and the specific action that results, and that then, precisely because it is a specific action, necessarily entails the principle of individuation, that is, it includes some concrete element of the material of experience. If this is correct, then the distinction Kant makes between speculative or theoretical interest and practical interest is by no means so radical. In this connection it is perhaps worthwhile my reminding you that he could only arrive at this radical distinction because he had once decided come hell or high water to deny any theoretical interest in these cardinal propositions. It is always valuable to be able to construct such aporetical situations, that is, to clarify for oneself what difficulties there are, on the one hand, and to discover the thema probandum, on the other, that is to say, what Kant actually wished to demonstrate. I believe that after these brief remarks you will have understood both. What is at issue here is the way in which Kant extricates himself from this entire situation when he talks of practice, and you must recollect that when Kant speaks of a critique of practical reason, he has a very definite and highly tendentious idea of practice in mind. Practical reason in Kant always means practical pure reason, in other words, the a priori ability to distinguish between right and wrong, good and evil, and not what we mean when we say of someone that he is a practical or an unpractical person. In this highly tendentious sense, that the words practice and practical have in Kant, it is as good as laid down and stipulated from the outset that this kind of practice has nothing to do with experience. This exclusion of experience of which I have told you and the difficulties that come in its train are so organized in his philosophy, that if he were here amongst us, and if he did not disdain to explain himself to us, and it is my belief that Kant would be the last person to think it beneath him, then I think he would probably say, indeed, what you mean by practice is utterly different from what I mean. When I use the term practice in this precise way, I would say quite simply that it is defined by the fact that it is independent of experience. And I believe that if you are to understand this entire complex of problems that we are concerned with in this semester, you should try to give an account to yourselves of the significance of this undervaluation of the role of experience, something we might also claim for Kant's treatment of it in the realm of theoretical reason too. In short, we might ask what significance it has within the Kantian system as a whole, the material of my feelings, therefore, and indeed everything that comes to me from outside, everything that is not me in the sense of being my own reason, is really no more than a stimulus. A view that is given a much blunter and more radical form in Fichte, his immediate successor. An action is supposed to be the direct product of my mind, and must be independent of any material that is tied to it, and I can only conceive of it as practical if it is independent, if it is my own act, and is bound to nothing that is not determined by me as a thinking, rational being, regarded socially. What that means, and it will perhaps be of assistance to you to think of these rather abstruse ideas in slightly more concrete terms, what that means is that something like a supreme metaphysical principle has been created out of the idea of the emancipation of the bourgeois individual, the idea of bourgeois autonomy. Humanity at the end of the 18th century was caught up in a struggle for bourgeois emancipation from tutelage, and it is as if this struggle were reflected in philosophy in such a way that this freedom, the freedom that had yet to be achieved, became the supreme principle, the principle in which philosophy reached its pinnacle and was equated with reason. You can only understand Kant, and particularly Kant's practical philosophy, properly once you realize that for him freedom and reason are actually the same thing, and similarly, the entire construction of the categorical imperative, about which we shall perhaps be able to say something today in this context, can only be understood if the very strange coupling of freedom and law that is contained in the categorical imperative is arrived at in such a way that the principle of freedom should itself be nothing but reason, pure reason, and that it should not be subject to constraints by anything external, alien to it, that is itself not rational. And the kernel of the Kantian idea here is that everything that I do not recognize as a purely rational being, and every rule that is not derived from my own reason actually restricts the principle of freedom. It does this because it binds me to something that is not myself, something that is alien to me and upon which I make myself dependent. Kant's so-called rigorism, the massive and almost inhuman harshness and severity, with which Kant excludes from his moral philosophy everything to do with happiness and everything that came to be regarded by his successors as an integral element of practice, all of that is excluded essentially for the sake of freedom. You have this very curious and paradoxical construction in Kant that in a certain sense the two conflicting impulses of moral philosophy, namely the idea of freedom and the idea of suppression, no better word occurs to me, the suppression, above all, of every natural impulse, the suppression of affection and the suppression of sympathy, both are really suppressed for the sake of freedom. The entire realm of impulses and interests, all of that is suppressed by Kant with a theoretically very cruel harshness, and really only so that I should not make myself dependent on anything that is incompatible with the principle of my own freedom, my own reason. I should draw your attention and passion to the fact that this system is predicated on the idea that we live in a world in which the fulfillment of my natural impulses, or whatever we may call them, my need for happiness, affection and everything else, is incompatible with reason as a universal principle, and all this happens without his ever really asking himself whether the absolute making real of reason does not entail the fulfillment of all the desires that have been suppressed. This problem only really surfaces in Kant in an extremely indirect and tortuous manner, namely in the conception of immortality, which is one of the three cardinal propositions. 2. It emerges here when Kant finally does concede that the world would be a hell 3, if it were not possible to achieve, and were it only in a transcendental realm, something like a unity of reason, and the impulses it has suppressed. It would be a hell, if this were not to lead to the absolute elimination of that dualism, which reflects in Kant's philosophy, the antagonistic, dualistic nature of the world in which we live. Therefore, if as acting human beings we make ourselves dependent on some material factor or other, if my action does not depend solely on my idea, and more particularly on my idea of the universal law, then it really ceases to be practical. It is no longer free. Thanks to this line of argument, the sphere of morality in Kant is in general construed as the sphere of freedom, because it would otherwise come within the sphere of mere nature, in which, as you have now heard at some length, causality holds sway to the exclusion of freedom, and which for that reason belongs entirely to theoretical reason, and not to pure practical reason. With that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, we can consider a sentence from the chapter we are examining here, the ultimate end of the pure employment of our reason, from section 1 of the Canon of Pure Reason. You will perhaps be in a better position to understand it now, since if you did not carry in your minds the arguments I have put before you, it might well appear somewhat forced. But now, following the work we have put in on it, I hope it will be quite transparent to you. By the practical I mean everything that is possible through freedom, for, if you now think through what I have said, then this statement will be comprehensible to you as a cornerstone of Kantian philosophy in general. There are, of course, certain difficulties with it, logical difficulties, for the situation in Kant is that the material of theoretical reason, insofar as it is mere material, is supposed to be quite indeterminate. It only assumes particular shape through me as a thinking being, thanks to the apparatus of the categories. This contradiction can itself only be explained in terms of the tension we have repeatedly returned to between the enlightened strand of thought in Kant that desires to expand the frontiers of nature as far as possible, and his wish to reinstate an earlier state of affairs, to call a halt to enlightenment, in which nothing would remain but blind nature, and the blind domination of nature. The entire problem that Kant's moral philosophy now finds itself confronted by is how to derive from his practical philosophy those three cardinal propositions or principles about which I spoke to you at the outset. I should draw your attention to the fact that Kant is continuing here a historical trend that began with Descartes. In this tradition, the absolute itself, the existence of God, is not placed at the very starting point of philosophy, but instead has to be inferred from that initial philosophy. In short, the existence of God has to be proved. This has the truly remarkable consequence, one that strikes the unprejudiced observer as paradoxical in the extreme, that the very thing that ought to be the piarchai, the very first thing in the hierarchy of ideas, is reduced to the status of something secondary and derivative. 5. Now if you pause to think about what lies behind the concept of reason in Kant, namely the freedom of human beings in action, then we can truly say that in this entire philosophy, the existence of God is made to depend on the human principle, namely the principle of human reason, and ever since philosophy has concerned itself with providing proof of its supreme metaphysical principles, that is, with making them commensurable with reason, as was already the case with the classical Thomist doctrine of the analogia entis. From that time on there has been an inherent tendency in philosophy to make its first and absolute principle dependent on something that should really be secondary, for a reason cannot itself be conceived of except as something abstracted from finite human beings, and made corporeal in them. From this vantage point, you can assess the program that Kant embarked on when he stated that if, then, These three cardinal propositions are not in any way necessary for knowledge, and yet are strongly recommended by our reason. Their importance, properly regarded, can concern only the practical. 6. This remarkable sentence that their importance can concern only the practical really means, even though it is not expressed as bluntly as I have here, that because they are important for practical reason, they must follow from practical reason, or, as it is stated later on in the same chapter, be proved through experience. 7. Kant now lands himself in a terribly difficult and disagreeable quandary, as happens not infrequently to us philosophers when we try to grapple with such matters. Remember that these three cardinal propositions or principles may not be inferred from pure thought alone. You have to think back to the structure of the Kantian system, which on its negative side consisted of a critique of the philosophy of Leibniz and Wolff. They had set out to deduce the existence of just such entities as God, freedom and immortality from pure thought alone, that is, from the pure principles of reason. Now in the entire negative part of the critique of pure reason, Kant showed in great detail that this was not possible, that it leads to contradictions, and I have discussed at length the decisive contradiction, the one relating to the idea of freedom, in connection with the third antinomy. On the other hand, however, these principles, and this is not something we need to discuss further, cannot be taken from experience either, for we are dealing with absolute principles, and to derive these absolute and universally valid principles from experience would mean making absolutely permanent, eternal, necessary and unchanging principles dependent on experiences that were themselves accidental and contingent. In the philosophical tradition we are dealing with here, and given the nature of Kantian philosophy itself, this would be a highly paradoxical demand that Kant could not accede to in any circumstances. In order to understand that in Kant ethics is constructed as an aporetical construct, that is to say, as a system that arises from the difficulties inherent in its initial situation, you need to understand how Kant extricates himself from this dilemma. He does so by establishing the principle of ethics, and we may say, in anticipation of what comes later, that this principle of ethics is none other than the moral law, that is, the categorical imperative, as a principle that is neither deduced from reason, since that would place him in the camp of the rationalists, nor from experience. Instead he says, the moral law is a fact, the moral law is a given 8, and this is the point on which the entire argument hinges. I have already told you of a number of pivotal points in Kant, but this is probably the most important of all. It is the decisive crux in the entire structure of moral philosophy in Kant. You will only be able to understand the groundwork of the metaphysic of morals, and the critique of practical reason, once you have grasped why he has to regard it as a given and with what justification he does in fact regard it as given. The further element of the argument is that if the moral law is a given, that is, if it simply exists and resists any further question as to its origin, its source, if in short it is an ultimate reality that underpins all knowledge, then it cannot dispense with those three principles or entities, God, freedom and immortality, if it is to be valid. And that is precisely the point which I drew to your attention in connection with Descartes, who likewise demonstrated the existence of God from the idea of the logical coherence of reason, because for a Descartes too if we were deceived in this regard it would be incompatible with the logical coherence of reason, and that is why we are in need of God. Naturally, this is only one side of the very complex argument about God in Descartes, who at this point also has recourse to another additional idea about the existence of God, namely the ontological argument. 9. At any rate, this is the point at which Kant lapses into the rationalist tradition of philosophy. If the moral law truly is a given, if, therefore, there is an absolute, unambiguous obligation so to act that the maxim or the supreme principle of my action could at the same time be made the principle of a universal law. 10. Then, and I should like you to take note that, once you have entered into the spirit of this Kantian tradition, these things do obey a very strict logic. The conclusion about freedom does follow in a very strict way, because this irresistible injunction to act in accordance with the categorical imperative would be quite senseless, unless I also had the ability to act as I am required to by this simply given and absolutely existing moral law. For if I did not have that ability, Kant would maintain, the existence of this moral law would be nothing more than a demonic, blind accident. The problem, and for us today, this is a very serious and relevant problem, is whether there might be a real contradiction between such a law, between the idea of a good and moral action and the ability to put it into practice. However, the question of whether there are circumstances when that ability is not available, is simply absent from Kant's theory, whereas for us, if we can be permitted to regard Kafka as a philosophical writer, we can see that one of the chief subjects of his writing starts at this point, and from there it has moved into the so-called philosophy of existentialism. In Kant, on the other hand, there is no sign of the absurdity that the idea of the good can exist, and the obligation to do good and act in conformity to the law likewise, but that human beings might be denied the possibility of so acting by the general social context, from which they cannot escape. When Kant says, "I must be free so that the moral law can be fulfilled," he is expressing an indescribable and to our ears almost naive optimism, that is in fact the optimism of the early bourgeoisie. We can hear it in the music of the young Beethoven, which also contains the idea that indeed, everything is possible, and if the good must exist then it must also be possible for it to be put into practice. 11. Here we encounter the magnificent, fascinating, and we could almost say inspiring aspect of this Kantian philosophy, that dwells side by side with its naivety, its limitation, that is so evident today, and you can see here how this utterly serious philosophy, a philosophy that always seeks out the hardest possible route, nevertheless finds itself embroiled in a terrible conflict. This conflict has nothing to do with any cheap relativizing of its principles, but arises instead from the fact that contradictions emerge between these different principles, between the principles of freedom and determination. For example, these contradictions are intensified and reproduce themselves, even though Kant imagined that he had done away with them once and for all by combining freedom and necessity in the concept of reason. By such means he believed that he had excluded from the outset the possibility that the demand for the good life could lead us into insoluble contradictions. Now the idea that the moral law can be a given is itself a curious matter. All of you, especially if you have some experience of philosophy, and particularly of epistemology, will be bursting to raise an objection at this point. You will say to me, you have not told us, or rather you have now given us an interpretation of Kant, and believe me, I have been faithful to Kant on this issue, according to which the practical is pure behavior, pure freedom, that is, a mode of behavior that is supposed to be absolutely independent of all experience. But damn it all, is not the concept of givenness the very essence of the concept of experience? Hasn't empiricism, the whole empiricist philosophical tradition, always insisted that it proceeds from facts that are givens, the data of immediate sense experience that it bases itself on, and hasn't it always claimed that anything that is not so given, but has been created by the subject, and produced, is supposed to be no more than an optional extra? This objection will have occurred to all of you, and you will all want to say Kant starts off by making a huge fuss about throwing out everything to do with experience. But he then goes on to claim that a moral law that absolutely transcends experience is itself no more than a given, and in saying this he smuggles experience back in through the back door. And if you are feeling malicious you will add, these philosophers are a fine lot to present us with tall stories like this, and try to pull the wool over our eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, there are all sorts of things that can be said about this. To this day we do not have a really adequate account of Kant's concept of the given. I believe that my colleague Wilhelm Sturmfels at one time worked on such a study. If I am correctly informed, this project was never completed. 12. It would be of the greatest importance for this concept of the given to be properly investigated, if there were any real Kant research going on that went beyond questions of a philological nature. Schopenhauer was perhaps the first to point out that the given is not limited to sincerity, but in some fashion also contains the deity who is supposed to have been the cause of whatever is given. 13. To that extent, then, the concept of the given has other roots than just the empirical, and I should like to conclude by saying that this concept of the given does not of course refer to immediately given sense data, but refers to quite a different order of things, without it being in any sense a mere sham. I shall attempt on Thursday to discuss this concept of the given more thoroughly. Thank you. Lecture 8, the 20th of June, 1963. Ladies and gentlemen, you will perhaps recollect that last time we at least made a start with our examination of the concept of the given in Kant with its manifold meanings, and above all of the problem that arises when the moral law, which he formulates in a highly general way, is presented as a given. Now you will remember no doubt that I began by saying that in moral philosophy,